So, JB, tell us about the treasure rocks. I have an example of one here. You can see 1632 in the triangle, maybe like a mountain. You can see a W that's pretty prominently marked as an arrow. Tell us about these treasure rocks, if you will.
Yeah, so this is a big part of all of the interest in the region for treasure, which was basically in the 1860s, and we don't know, it could have been earlier, but in the 1860s was when a major discovery happened. A settler named Will Snyder hit upon one of these rocks with his plow. And then pretty quickly in the ensuing decade or so, other people started finding other so-called treasure rocks. And these rocks really fuel the imagination, right? Because they have these mysterious marks. People have actually followed them to other rocks and other items based on their interpretation. After Will Snyder plowed up this treasure rock, subsequently, there were a lot of other people who got involved in the treasure hunting, and one of them was Pat Smith, who was the son of Hiram Smith, a Tillamook pioneer. And Pat Smith really got into this treasure hunting business. Do you want to talk a little bit about what he did?
Well, so he's an interesting fellow because I've heard that he really studied Spanish so that he could understand the original documents about these Manila galleons that he might be encountering. Mm-hmm. But, I have heard that maybe he got documents from the archives in Seville, or maybe he actually traveled to Seville to go through the archives himself. It's kind of wishy-washy, but is that out of the realm of possibility of the things you know about Smith?
Not necessarily. I mean, he, like you said, he learned the language, he learned Spanish, he took surveying correspondence courses. He also married a member of the Clatsop peoples who he hoped would give him some more information about what he was looking for. And I think one of the most fascinating things about Pat Smith's story is at one point, we're not sure exactly what the date was, but two people showed up from Spain with an old survey map and said, if you show us the rocks, we'll basically, bring our evidence together and we'll help with this map figure out what all this is about. And he turned them down.
He was so confident.
He just basically said, I'm good. I don't, and that happens a lot with treasure, right? Because that's part of the issue with treasure. It's like, stay away. This is my thing. I don't want anyone else finding it.
Isn't there a level of arrogance as well in these treasure hunters?
I think so. Arrogance, and I'd say just determination, just being so set on your sights, right? That this is what you're going to do. I mean, people spent a lot of money on this stuff. Like, we have examples of treasure hunters spending like thousands of dollars, right?
All of their savings.
All of their savings.
Investors' savings.
Mm-hmm. Just going into this with that promise that there's something there. And I really, truly believe that they're not doing that completely haphazardly. I mean, maybe in some cases there's obviously a lot of risk involved, but they're not necessarily on a hunch, just simply saying, oh, there's this rock, I'm going to shell out all this money to go and dig, right? So we do have that, and we have a lot of examples pretty much through the 20th century of people who really dedicated their time and their lives to looking for this, right? And it ended up being called the Mountain of 1,000 Holes for that reason, because so many people were digging on it. And it's a dangerous endeavor, right? It's not just expensive and costly time and money-wise. It's also deadly. Turned out in the early 1930s, a father-son team, Charles and Lynn Wood, died when the hole they were digging on the mountain collapsed, and they were suffocated, right? So there's like real tragedy. So things really slowed down by the 1950s. A lot of treasure hunters were starting to realize they were investing a lot of time and effort into this and not really finding much in the way of results. But in the late 1950s, a book comes along that really changes that. Lost Mines and Treasures of the Pacific Northwest by Ruby L. Holt, who was a Pacific Northwest historian. And L. Holt's book inspired a whole new generation of treasure hunters to Neahkahnie Mountain. And one of the things that happened was she got so popular that she wrote a follow-up book. And in that book, she tells a story of one of those treasure hunters who came to Neahkahnie Mountain between that time. And that was Ed Fire, a.k.a. Tony Marino. So one of the things that makes us so excited about Ed Fire is that his story really is different from all these others, right? I mean, what is it about Ed Fire that really sets him apart?
Well, I think the thing about Ed Fire that I really appreciate is kind of the humanity that he brings to the story. I mean, he's absolutely a flawed character, a tragic character. He was absolutely convinced that he was finding it. And when you look at his determination and all the tribulations, the trials that he went through, and to still be looking for it 40 years later, it's astounding.
Yeah, all the way into the 1990s, right? And say what you will about him or about the treasure hunting business overall. But the one thing too that he had that no one else really had was the story of what he claimed to have found, right?
Yeah.
Which was phenomenal because it went well beyond rocks. It went well beyond beeswax, right? And what he was saying that he was uncovering there was really the next level.
So you look at Ed Fire, and here, and at least on the face of it, is this house painter from Salem who gets wrapped up into this treasure story, and the press really kind of gets onto him. But you look at the amount that he studied into this. I mean, he takes the treasure rocks, he takes the DE that's written on him, he says, well, that's from Deuteronomy. And he takes BKS, and he says, well, that's from the Book of Kings. And he uses specific biblical interpretations to help him find kind of justification of knowing exactly where the treasure is.
So Tony Marino left Manzanita in the late 60s. He was fed up digging on the beach. He hadn't found what he wanted. He faced a lot of pushback from the community. He was even shot at a couple times. He left, but he came back in the 1980s and 90s. And when he did, he was known as Ed Fire, his real name. And what he claimed to have found at that point was really game-changing.
So he claimed that he went inside the tunnels, clay tunnels, that he said were dug by Moors. Mm-hmm. And as we know from our expedition team, there's obviously caverns and further tunnels that go back there. So not at all inconceivable that there would be man-made structures as well. What else did he document that he saw down in those tunnels?
Yeah, interesting. So it should be pointed out, too, that he basically found a tunnel system that basically conforms to the W on this treasure rock. And one of the things that he was basically identifying was that this was a tunnel network that led to what he called a central chamber, right? And this is where he believed the Ark of the Covenant would be. But he didn't actually ever reach the chamber, but he did say that he had found all kinds of things in those tunnels, including murals on the walls, benches carved by humans, right?
Hewn
man by man, as he would say. So these kinds of things, as he was encountering this tunnel system and exploring it, right, he was more and more convinced that this was all this network that basically a hiding place. So Doug, essentially Ed Fire, a.k.a. Tony Marino, isn't successful. At least we don't know for sure, right? As treasure hunting goes, you will never know for sure. But doesn't seem to be successful and it fades away. But his legacy endures in part because, as you said, so many people, including his descendants, claim that he was the inspiration for Mikey and the Goonies. So
yeah, and I think if you look at that film, it's hard knowing Ed's story. It's hard to extract him from that character as you're watching it. And the fact that he used to bring his own kids, like on the beach down to Manzanita in the summer in the 1960s.
Yeah, in fact, Ed Fire in 1990 in an interview with the Neahkahnie Valley Historical Society said that 2 kids, and I have no idea what this referred to, 2 kids helped lead him up onto the mountain once he found the carvings on this capstone that told him to go up to the mountain. 2 kids helped him with that. I mean, how Goonies can you get? So in the 90s, Ed Fire finally throws in the towel. Why did he do that?
So he has all these kind of stories of this really weird shit happening. And that's when he got freaked out, again, according to one of his unnamed descendants. And he went ahead and burned all of the Polaroids that he had taken from inside the tunnels.
Right. And that's one of the things that's so telling about this is even valuable evidence like that was destroyed because he was so impacted by these kinds of fears, right? And
his religious fervor,
Mm-hmm.
his devotion to Christianity and Catholicism, I think, is absolutely entwined in all of that.
Mm-hmm. And I think another factor too is he wasn't the first to be impacted by Neahkahnie that way in terms of a very long tradition of a sense that something is going on up on Neahkahnie Mountain, right? That there was some kind of a supernatural, spiritual element to this whole story. It may have something to do with the place, the geography, the lay of the land, but also all these other elements we're bringing in.